Come on into the ditch. I'm your resident ditch witch, Tara Tyne, and we're about to get witchy, whether you like it or not. Today, I am honoured to be joined by Niall Roycroft and Shane Delaney, archaeologist and senior archaeologist, respectively, on the M1 dig sites, which happened around 2002 to 2004, excuse me, when works were being prepared for the building of the M1 motorway. So there was a lot of very interesting stuff, lads. First of all, a huge welcome. Thank you for joining me here this evening.
Thanks. Hello.
So I suppose we were just chatting there beforehand, and you were telling me that there were over 30 dig sites in total round the Dundalk and wider area in preparation for the motorway. And there was so much stuff found between all of those sites. So when I was preparing for this interview, I thought, oh, how are we going to do this now? Because the townlands that are mentioned mightn't even be known to people from the town themselves unless they actually live there. So, what we're going to do in no particular order is sort of dip into some of the more interesting finds that were found at the time and just sort of, I suppose, nitpick those and get you to tell us a little bit about those. So, we're going to jump right into it if that's all right with yous. We're going to start with the Balregan Henge Bank. So, some of our listeners and viewers have probably already heard of the likes of Stonehenge. And when we think of Stonehenge, we tend to think of all those big standing stones. But a henge itself is actually like a raised, curved embankment, isn't it? It's sort of it's more an earthen bank than the actual stones. Not all henges had those big stones on them. And there was a good one found at Balregan with, I thought it was a very interesting way of creating one. Um, the quote from your report here, Niall, is Balregan Henge Bank was founded on a layer of water-rolled stones collected from the adjacent rivers. I suppose that kind of makes sense using what's available. These would have secured the base to a very high, probably turf bank, a technique which was made famous by the Romans in Hadrian's Wall around the 2nd century. So under all of this, you've got your water rolled stones, you've got your turf, which would have had to have presumably been dug out and stuck on top. Under the stones were over 1,000 shards of Neolithic pottery, possibly placed there as part of a foundation ritual. So that's very interesting, lads. Like, would they have gone and gathered this pottery especially for it, or was it again making use of materials that they would have had to hand?
Well, the pottery was all smashed, and it simply was covered where it fell. So it was very much like a sort of Greek wedding where everyone threw their glasses into the fireplace once they'd finished using these potteries, and the spread could have been much wider, but it's only survived where the bank covered it.
Hmm.
And the bank of stones sort of protected it from later ploughing, and the stones themselves were a sort of key sort of to hold the bank, which a henge is sort of an enclosing feature. It's the sort of common thing. Um, so
What was the purpose of a henge, Niall?
well, it was if you think of it as you described, a bank going round that enclosed the space within it, and so that whatever rituals and goings on went on inside there, it was there was no view from to the surrounding landscape. So say there was a stone circle in the middle of the one at Balregan, and whatever they did in there, it was all focused on that point.
Right. And I suppose that, people's first reaction when you think of things like ring forts and stuff like that would be maybe it was defensive, but it would seem that it was sort of the ditches on the outside and possibly the inside that actually would have been the defensive features on henges that were used or, would have had defensive aspects to them. So you reckon it's more got to do with rituals. And I suppose from a practical aspect, if there's going to be fire involved in that, it's probably easier to get a fire lit in a hilltop when there's a bit of a raised embankment round you. So these
Well,
shards, sorry.
sorry, I mean, just when these weren't they weren't defensive sites at all, because
Mm.
typically the bank is on the inside. I mean, the ditch is on the inside of the bank,
Yeah.
which defensively is a pointless thing to do.
Yeah.
And a henge site found in County Meath at Kilshane, the ditch was full of slaughtered cattle. So there was obviously a lot of feasting and going on like that,
Yeah.
because you wouldn't just kill a cow, you'd eat it as well.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of goings on in these enclosures, and
Yeah.
they're very different from ring forts.
Yeah. Are they often found on hilltops, or is that even a regular feature with them?
No, this was the Balregan one was found on the plains,
Mm.
and it was had the Castletown River on one side and the Kilcurry River on the other, and
Mm.
it was at the head of Dundalk Bay. So it was a sort of ritual site looking out to the sea on the
Yeah.
low ground.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Did they always have nice views or nice landscape around them, or were they sometimes just put anywhere at all?
No,
Like,
they had the choice of the landscape in those days,
indeed they
and
did.
yeah,
No
so
planning
we think
permission back then.
we think that a lot of these henge sites were put on the edges of people's territories, so that
Okay.
two groups of people could meet there.
Oh wow.
And the rivers at the Castletown and Kilcurry sort of represent possibly boundaries. So to the north you've got the hills,
Mm.
and to the south you've got the plains. And
Mm.
quite often we think that the Neolithic people will be moving between these two landscapes, because they'd be using the hills for sheep and stuff
Mm-hmm.
like that, the rivers for fishing, salmon and stuff like
Mm.
that, and then the plains for summer grazing of cattle. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
these people will be moving around the landscape quite a lot, and
Yeah.
then maybe once a year or whatever they meet and have a big feast.
Yeah, yeah, wow, that's
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah.
So I suppose it's the much later practice of what we knew as bullying. There would have been an awful lot of that going on, but I like the idea of them all getting together and having a big feast at the end. That's what you should do after a season of hard grazing. One of the other sites that I thought, I just kind of, when I was reading the report, I went, "Wow, that's amazing," was the Kearns Moore Kist Cemetery. Actually, now that I have two archaeologists on, do you say Kist or Sist, lads?
Kist.
Kist, yeah, yeah. So the Kearns Moore Kist Cemetery, fascinating. It was a main grave, which would appear to, we'll talk about the importance of that in a second, but there were like 8 sort of satellite grave sites around it, 8 satellite burials to it. But there was also what appears to be a sort of granite animal, which was surmised as possibly being a resting sheep or a cow, and it had a hole pierced into one side of it. So is this kind of thing common?
No, it's definitely not very common at all. I mean, we think this granite animal, which is about a meter and a half long, might have been mostly a naturally weathered piece of rock that had been spotted, and someone said, "Do you know what that looks like? I'm going to have that and put it in this grave." So they didn't sort of start with a boulder and end up with this thing. It was probably already worn into roughly that shape, and then they'd taken it from wherever they found it and put it on this grave in a place that was probably prominent, and it had a sort of flat part up to the back of its neck where you could have put something, a pot or whatever.
Wow.
And there was another big stone next to it which had cups. Now they're in it. So whatever was going on there, it seems to be that they were deliberately marking this important grave.
Wow.
And in the grave underneath, there was a lovely intact pot and cremation in it.
Wow.
So
And when you
I
say
suppose
there were,
just
sorry,
something
Shane.
interesting. Yeah, something interesting about that other stone that Niall mentioned with the cup marks in it is
Yes.
that represented a much earlier tradition that was probably earth fast somewhere else and had been smashed out of its original location and brought to this site and put on this particular mound, which again emphasizes its importance.
Yeah.
And possibly again, like with the earlier site at Balregan, maybe marking some kind of an ancestral sort of territory.
Mm. That's fascinating. And why, I mean, while I have you and talking about cup marks, like we have mentioned cup and ring marks on this channel before, and it's hard to figure out what the point of them was. Have you any ideas? Do you know any more than I do about it, or are they just a thing that shows up a lot at important sites?
Well, it is a thing that sort of comes up a lot, and there are many theories, but of course they can only be theories
Of
because there was
course. Yeah.
no one to say. Some people say about ripples of water that you drop a pebble in the water and you get
Yeah.
this thing, or other people could say it's the Earth surrounded by the Milky Way, which was thought to be circular,
Mm.
or it could be the moon with a 22-degree halo that you get on winter's nights. I mean, could be anything that
Yeah.
looks like a cup and a ring. But
Yeah.
whatever it was clearly, and again, the cup, they could have put something in it, like
Yeah.
something important.
Like an offering, yeah. And so the
Yeah,
hole that was
an egg.
carved was the hole carved into the side of this massive big granite animal, or was that a natural feature? Do we think that maybe was the hole another feature that might have been used for offerings, or
Yeah, it could have been because in a granite boulder, they tend to wear into sort of rounded shapes. And this hole was quite unusual,
hmm.
but you couldn't tell whether it was specifically deliberate or whether it was accidental.
Hmm.
It was probably deliberate.
Hmm.
But again, with all these things, it's because they're so worn. The original workings are not very clear on these things.
It's hard to make out, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I suppose we're talking thousands of years ago, but I suppose coming back to the graves on that site. So the main burial kist, the one in the center, contained what were recorded as the pommel of a ceremonial dagger and a bronze pin with a twisted faience glass coating. It has been suggested that faience, which was a sort of an early form of silica glass, it's very pretty actually, that may have been a form of supernatural power dressing. Could this mean that the person interred in that central pit was someone of ritual or magical importance? And what could the significance of the 8 surrounding pits be? We hazard some guesses.
Well, I think it's probably fair to say that whoever was the central burial was very important
Mm.
within their grouping.
Yeah.
Um, when we're talking about whether it has magical significance, it's sure everything back in the day had some kind of a magical significance because you couldn't explain it off by how we think as modern people. So I would imagine that anyone who was imbued with the power uh, over a grouping would have some kind of significance that you could possibly read into that way.
So the way
But I
we
mean,
look at
as for artifacts and what we can say about them, we can't imply that there's that kind of significance.
yeah, yeah, I think that the study I had read about that, the faience glass specifically, it was Sheridan and Shortland, and I can't rightly remember now what examples they were quoting to suggest that it may have been a form of supernatural power dressing. But I suppose that could be as mundane as, I mean, we say everything had magical significance, but at the same time, you don't want to make them sound like they were silly people who just thought everything came from. But these days, I suppose the monarchy. You look at the monarchy, and they're thought to have been given their power from God. So it's really only a kick in the arse away from that kind of thing, isn't it? And
Because we were thinking that the faience thing and the shield boss, or whatever it is, was a later offering into the mound. So we think that they whatever presence that grave had continued for several hundred years,
Mm.
and even several hundred years later, people were putting things into that
Wow.
grave because they obviously had a history of the importance.
Yeah.
And then the ring of burial kists around it. There's something similar to that on the mound of the hostages on the
Mm.
hill of Tara,
Yeah.
where the central passage tomb has a lot of Bronze Age kists around basically dating roughly the same time as these ones.
Mm.
So we think that maybe the original grave at the Kearns Moore probably had a mound on it that's been lost or ploughed away, and maybe that's what these outer ring was being using as a guide to where they were
To
buried.
bury the people
Yeah.
around it, like, so they
Yeah.
may have been related in some way, you know, socially
Well,
or
what's
politically to
interesting,
the
yeah, what's
person
interesting
at the
about
center.
Carnmore Cemetery is that it covers about 600 years of kind
Mm.
of burial evolution.
Okay.
So you're starting off with a different type of burial rite, which develops, which is consistent with other kind of Bronze Age developments in burials throughout the country, but you have it here in one location. So that means it was being constantly returned to. So that means it was very definitely known in the landscape.
Okay.
But it has to have been of very significant burials, because there was a limit to the amount of burials that we found. So if you know that there's a burial site, a special place that's known about for 600 years, you would imagine that everybody was going to be buried there, but they weren't. It's very specific in the amount of burials that are in it. But we get a development from like the Barrow, the mound over the central kist to the ring of kist burials, and then we get some kind of random outlying burials, and then we also get smaller ring barrows, which would appear to be later in the development. So from that perspective, it's very interesting.
Absolutely. And I got the impression from from Niall's report that those 8 satellite burials would probably have been initially worked into the design plan of the site. So it's not like there was just 8 people kind of coming along afterwards and being added, although some of the ones that were a little, you know, further away, a little more outside of that, they were probably likely much later ones. So, you know, the 8 satellite graves, they may have known the person buried at the center personally, or they may not have. They may have been slightly later. Is that what I'm getting there?
Yeah. Now,
Okay.
we also have a problem with that site in that we excavated so much of it, and it was such an opportunity, a fantastic opportunity.
Of course.
But the space of the site was cut by the construction of the railway. So there's a huge area to the sort of northeast of the site that we didn't get to look at because there's the railway cutting and embankment there. But one can only guess that the cemetery extended into that area. So
Wow.
and they wouldn't have employed archaeologists back then, unfortunately.
Of
So
course,
we've
yeah.
no idea what has been lost.
God.
Yeah, I think there's aerial photos of ring barrows and things the other side of the railway. So it's a kilometre graveyard. It's massive.
That's some tantalizing stuff.
Yeah.
Definitely. So another site, and kind of harking on from very interesting rocks, because there's a lot of that goes on in archaeology. So I noticed that in both the Newtown Balregan and are we pronouncing it Tatitra or Tatitra?
Tatitra.
I think it's Tatitra.
Yeah.
Tatitra, okay. Just I know Tati is it's a common word for a field around the Loud Monaghan area, but in the Newtown Balregan and the Tatitra Souterrains, we have examples of reused prehistoric rocks, which contain some lovely trumpet and lozenge carvings, and I'll stick a photo of that up here as well. So I think that happens from flicking through archaeological reports. That seems to happen quite a lot, where stones will have been moved hundreds or thousands of years ago from their original resting site and relocated to like a new build site. So when these souterrains were being completed, they were taking these highly decorated stones in some case from other places and including them in their souterrains. So do you find it more informative or frustrating as archaeologists when features like this are moved off-site and reused elsewhere?
Well, the what you say there is fascinating, because in fact the Newtown Balregan stone was moved deliberately and used as a feature in the Souterrain, whereas the ones in Tatitra seem to be just pieces of stone that they
Wow.
cut up and used as building material, because the Souterrains were normally built in an area where the Vikings were attacking and all the rest. So there's a sort of crisis going on, and sometimes they just need building material and they don't care what's on it.
Yeah.
And that was the Tatitra ones, because there were so many stones they needed for that site. They just wanted stones,
Yeah.
and the stones that they took there are both early medieval, early Christian, to do with some now lost church site, presumably, because there was a part of an altar and there was part of a boundary marker stone. But the altar had been split in two, and the crosses that were on that altar weren't really visible from the inside Souterrain. Whereas at Newtown Balregan, they'd taken a piece of passage to Mart and used it in the gallery, and possibly put a light box in the wall near it to light it at night.
Yeah.
So they were actually displaying it as a piece of art,
Wow.
for whatever reason, in their Souterrain. So there's two different traditions going on. So that's fascinating in itself, because the art, wherever it came from, is being used in one site for display, and as the other as just being ignored. So it sort of shows the status of the site and the times that we're living in.
Yeah, so really it depends on when your Souterrain was being built as to how bothered you were featuring the lovely art
But
that you were taking.
it's interesting that the Souterrain at Tatitra had the early Christian rock carving in it, because you would have assumed that the people that were building it were from that early Christian tradition as well. So the symbolism of the rocks wouldn't be unknown to them, because there's churches in and around the location. Whereas in the other Souterrain, where they've actually displayed the rock art, there's 3,000 years of a difference between the cultures.
Yes, yeah. So I mean, they might just have been guessing the same as we are about what they meant. And whilst on that topic, I know it's incredibly difficult to get archaeologists to speculate on the meanings of rock carvings, but I'm going to ask you anyway, lads.
Yeah, I'll leave that one to Shane.
Just wind bushes their
Yeah.
silence.
No, it's well, Bush O'Sullivan would know more about that.
Yeah. Oh, and I asked him about it, and I'll be asking him about it again.
Yeah. No, I mean again, it's a minefield of theoretical. People can see what they see, but a lot of the time they're making shapes out of the rock that they have found. So if you look around the curbstones at Knowth, there'll be a lot of art will be focusing on the lumps and bumps of the stone or the projections, and it'll be creating features of those bits. But the exact, whether a wiggly line means a worm or a river, we don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I suppose, like you say, some of the sites, particularly the Souterrains, would have had light boxes worked in, so you have to kind of imagine how they'd look under that kind of natural lighting as well. You know, we have the benefit of floodlights and things, spotlights we can put on them these days, but it would have been a different experience for people at different eras throughout history. So yeah, one thing I usually look for, going back to you know, different sites when we're looking at the history of places, because I did see it said at one point very early in my studies that, you know, Neolithic houses were kind of rare, and there were 6 found in total around the Dundalk stretch of the motorway, if I'm not mistaken, but they're described as being Neolithic / early Bronze Age domestic settlement sites. So does that mean we're not sure of the exact date when they were built, or that, you know, were they in use for a long period of time, or what do you actually mean by that, lads?
Yeah, well, late Neolithic, early Bronze Age sort of refers to a transition period between
Okay.
the late Neolithic, which hasn't got much archaeological evidence, and the sort of early Bronze Age, which has
Okay.
got an enormous amount of archaeological evidence.
Okay.
So we tend to think that it seems to relate to the sort of arrival of metal in the form of copper tools into Ireland. Sometimes it's called the Chalcolithic, and it seems to go with the arrival of the Beaker people, who
Yes.
had a sort of their own toolbox of flints and pottery vessels, and they seem to be different from the indigenous population. So we think that they arrived with their equipment, and they were very hard to date for a long time. So because while they were doing their thing, the rest of the indigenous people were doing their own thing. So they
Yeah.
weren't really mixing a lot for a couple of 100 years until everyone starts doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a sort of intermediate period, which was relatively hard to date. But we think we've got to grips with it now. Certainly around Dundalk,
Okay.
the people, the Beaker people or whatever, arrive 2,400 BC, and they're really getting going by 2000 BC.
Okay.
And further inland, you don't find those sort of sites because these new guys stuck to the coast quite a lot of the time.
Yeah, well, I mean, as a lot of us tend to do even today. So we're really talking 4,500 years ago, you had this other kind of culture of beaker pottery coming in that had their own tools and were kind of doing their own thing. So that's very interesting. And yeah, it's still kind of said in certain quarters that so Neolithic houses are rare. So the older, as you described, the people who were here before, I suppose that in layman's terms you'd be talking that's like the Stone Age. So why is it still thought that Neolithic houses are rare? Because we seem to be discovering a hell of a lot of them around Louth and Meath and Monaghan.
Well, traditionally, it was access to the evidence that made them rare. So what's happened over the last 25 years is we've had loads of roads built, and the roads come with their package of archaeologists who do advanced archaeological testing and find these sites. Also, you're finding that in areas, say, where there's been very large development of, say, housing estates or industrial complexes, you're getting more and more of the archaeology that in the past has been missed or not noticed or not identified. So by us now saying that there's more and more of them, we're just seeing more of them. But we are getting an idea that the spread of the settlement of Neolithic houses is pretty widespread, and it's across the entire country because they're being found in every county wherever there's
Everywhere. Yeah, I thought
yeah.
that. They seem to be popping up all over the place. And I suppose in a way we're just lucky in Dundalk because you've got that crossover of, as you say, the people at the time, a lot of them would have stuck to the coast, so there'd be a lot of evidence of people having lived there, and also the fact that the area is still highly populated, and real estate is highly sought after. So there's a lot of development still happening like that. You didn't know this stuff was there until we needed a motorway. So, and not necessarily something that would be put through more rural areas in the country. So for all we know, the island of Ireland is teeming with Neolithic houses. It's just that we haven't found them yet.
Well, the funny thing is that they've dated a couple of hundred of them across the country, and for the Neolithic period that lasts 1,000 or whatever many years, all the Neolithic houses seem to date within 100 years of each other.
Wow.
Around, because they, again, like the Beaker people, when the Neolithic people arrived, they must have arrived en masse over a couple of 100 years, and this is the house that they built, the big rectangular ones, and they built them everywhere. And after a couple of 100 years, they started building houses in a different shape, and they weren't as well built, say, and not as easy to find archaeologically. So a sort of middle to late Neolithic house was very, very, very hard to find. Whereas these early ones that we found at Dundalk are quite substantial, and they're quite easy to find.
Okay, so yeah, just another example of mind-blowing stuff being found. There was just such a selection of stuff found. And my next question pertains to that too. So, moving on to some of the slightly later sites, the 6th or 7th century ring fort at Newtown, Balregan, may possibly have been connected with leatherworking. There were 200 pieces of struck flint found, which is something that's very useful for working a hide. But there were also a small copper brooch, some superbly decorated glass beads, some other dress brooches, and some Souterrain pottery found, which predominantly hails from East Ulster. So it's quite a broad selection of finds for one location. Like, I could walk into a well-stocked modern craft shop and find this same selection of items, but would they all have been made locally?
Well,
Yeah, well, the
yeah,
leather would have been well made locally,
Mm-hmm.
but Shane, did you wanted to?
yeah. No, the flints from that site aren't necessarily from the early medieval occupation of the site. The flints could be from earlier activity at the site.
Mm-hmm.
Because they certainly, from what I remember of those flints, there was a lot of characteristically kind of late Neolithic, early Bronze Age, possibly beaker items. So because they were found at the site, it's probably not a great connection to say that they were necessarily used on the Ringfort site.
Okay. But say for the likes of the copper brooch, the glass beads, the other dress brooches that were found, would they have been produced locally, or would they have been brought from elsewhere?
It's hard to know because we didn't actually find any evidence that metal was being worked on the site.
Okay.
Like normally you'd find a kiln or some sort of work area where there'd be lots of fragments and bits. And the same with glass making, you'd need a kiln. And
Mm.
we think that certainly some of the glass beads could even have been imported from Britain. And there was one that had a lovely yellow spiral in, which could have been like a mere spiral. And mere comes from the um, original site where they were made in near Somerset in Britain in the Iron Age. And
Yeah.
if it was one of those Iron Age mere spirals, by the time it had got to Newtown Balregan and ended up in the ditch,
Mm.
several centuries would have passed. So that bead could have been passed down as an heirloom through several generations
Mm-hmm.
before it ended up being lost. And we often find that in these ring forts, there's often a big clearance where they sort of they clear the site and redesign it, and in that process, a lot of stuff gets thrown away. So you often find in the ditch there's a layer of all this sort of stuff where all the rubbish, but also some of the stuff they didn't want to throw away but
Mm.
accidentally lost
Mm-hmm.
is found, and I think
That
that's what happened at Newtown Balregan.
that's fascinating. There's just so much stuff pulled out of it. And where have all of these finds ended up? Where are they all now?
They're all in the Dundalk Museum, and
Okay, so people
locally.
can just go in and have a look at all these fascinating items that were
Well,
found.
a lot of them, a lot of I don't know how much is on display, but certainly the early Bronze Age pottery bowls from the kists at Kearns Moore,
Mm-hmm.
they're on display, and I think that granite animal is in the yard outside somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that's where all the material is kept locally.
Yeah, so get in there, people, and have a look. Because we seem to have lived in a place that was just coming down with artifacts, with just beautiful decorative items, with practical pieces that really tell us the story of the people who lived in the area. So get in and have a look. There's really something for everyone in the Dundalk Museum. 100% can confirm. So we have then, just talking about Tatitra again, so we've got two conjoined and intact souterrains which were found there adjacent to the Castletown River and overlooking the Balregan archaeological complex, which in itself is a very impressive and contained ceremonial enclosure, a barrow and a standing stone along with a Bronze Age cemetery. You've said that even though there was no enclosure found yet near the Souterrains, there was likely a high status site nearby. What brought you to that conclusion, Niall?
Well, the Souterrains at Tatitra in total measured 70 meters long,
Mm.
and that's a massive undertaking to build
Mm.
an underground structure of that size. It seems to have been built in two halves. So there was a more traditional souterrain that was winding along about maybe 35 meters, very narrow, very constricted, a
Mm.
few traps in it, a few trap doors in it. And then the other one was basically a souterrain that was so big you could basically stand up and walk in it with your arms held out. I mean, souterrains of that size are very rare,
Mm.
very unusual, and would have taken an enormous amount of effort to build. And even in that one, there was an internal door and there was air vents, and it was so big, but also so easy to access. There were no traps or anything. We were wondering whether you could even have hidden some cattle or sheep in there, because if you had a Viking raid or something, those would be the things that the Vikings would want to be stealing, and you
Mm.
want to keep an eye on them. And so the Tatitra site is so big it couldn't be put inside a ring fort or anything because it's much bigger than even many ring forts. So
Wow.
there must have been a high status site nearby
Yeah.
to supply the labor and use the thing, because the Castletown River there is right at the head of Dundalk Bay. So you're actually in a quite a vulnerable location. If you
Mm.
think of raiders on boats, anyone could come up that river and attack you in the middle of the night. So
Mm.
you'd have to be quite a strong site to be able to defend yourself against that.
Yeah, indeed. And Shane, you were actually on location there. Like, what does it feel like when you uncover something like that? And you sort of strip it back and go, holy crap, this is a massive souterrain. You never see
Oh,
the likes of this.
it's mind blowing. I was fortunate enough that I was allowed the site director David Bailey
Mm.
at Newtown Balregan when he uncovered the souterrain there. I was fortunate enough to be the first one to crawl down the passageway,
Wow.
and that was special because nobody had been down there in hundreds of years,
Mm.
and we we didn't expect it, and we certainly didn't expect the scale of what that souterrain turned out to be.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it was a mind-blowing, privilege, amazing experience. Plus, very humbling to see what these people were able to build in the past. Not that, technically they shouldn't have been able to, but they did. And as Niall alluded to earlier, there was like at the Newtown Balregan one, there were air vents. There was a big corbel chamber at the bottom. There was strategically placed drop holes with a false door, and also the door into the main part of the souterrain could be bolted from the inside, so it's very definitely a protective measure.
Mm. God, it's probably just as well I never ended up as an archaeologist because I'd be all, I've probably seen Indiana Jones one too many times. I'd be hoping there's no big spiked balls coming flying out of
But
the
sure,
thing at me. There
but
was
sure,
no
that's why we're
ghosts
all
going.
archaeologists.
There was no ghosts going. Get out of me, Souterrain. Was there saying jumped out at you? No.
Yeah, and just to say that although the Newtown Balregan souterrain is actually at the location of the N53 interchange, so that had to come out. But the Tatitra souterrain is still there underneath the motorway. We just recorded it, backfilled it, covered it up, and it's still there. So so every time you drive on the motorway there, you're passing over this massive souterrain.
Wow. There you go, people.
Mm,
You'll never be able to drive that stretch again without thinking about that.
yeah.
And souterrains are often said to have served a defensive purpose. You know, that's you were talking about that there, and not all of them were. You've said that both souterrains at Tatitra were clearly meant to be locked from inside, and Souterrain 2 also contained what appeared to be an altar and was capped with prehistoric standing stones. Do you think they would have gone down there to, pray or do their ritual things, or did it just signify that this might have had to spend long periods of time down there?
Well, like we were saying earlier, I think the ritual stones in the Tatitra Souterrain were just used for building material.
Mm,
And what we have found is that on this site, on the Tatitra Souterrain, and in one at Fart Lower, there are things hidden in souterrains. So the Tatitra one had a large shaped rock that someone had hidden something over underneath and dug out later, because the hole of it where they dug it was still there.
wow.
And in the far lower one, they'd actually buried a plough coulter, an iron plough coulter about a meter or so long, and that was dating about 1000 AD, and it had obviously been hidden down there and never collected. So they're certainly using souterrains for all sorts of things, but for praying and religious things, we're not sure about that now.
Okay,
Yeah.
so why would we have something that would appear to be an altar down there?
Well, that was just used as a piece of building stone. So
Okay,
yeah, so it wasn't set up in the ground. It was actually just used as a capping for the passage.
okay, all right,
But,
okay. Well,
but
that makes
again,
a
at
lot more
Newtown
sense.
Balregan, they had the decorative stone that was possibly lit from the light box. So that could have had all sorts of meaning. But
Ritualistic importance, yeah.
ritual, yes, lock you in there overnight and come out again if you're still sane. We'll
Yeah,
let
the,
you
the kind of
try.
rite of passage thing. Like we have a
Yeah,
lot of that in Irish archaeology where there's like a
yeah.
really dark hole in the ground a lot of the time or in a mound. And you can imagine sort of young fellas and maybe young women too just being shoved in there for a night or three and told when they come out they were adults then that
The sort of
they'd made it through.
confirmation.
Yeah, like the
Yeah.
confirmation. Probably a slight bit more crack. So when you're looking at capstones and saying that they are prehistoric standing stones, and this is something I personally just wonder, like how do you know? I mean, I've been looking at sort of decorated stones and standing stones and stuff for about 2 years now, and to be honest, I wouldn't be able to tell one from the other, not even close. So
Yeah.
how do
Well,
you kind of go that used to be a standing stone, but now it's not standing up anymore?
no, and it's the 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 Balregan henge was drawn in the 18th century by Thomas Wright, and he
Mm,
showed lots of these little stumpy stones all around the place in circles, but there were lots missing.
okay.
And the Tetra Souterrain, you could see that these stones, which are meter and a half high, had been basically split very professionally split into two or three slices, and each of these slices had been used as a capstone for the passage of the souterrain.
Yeah.
So when you put the pieces back together, you ended up with a sort of worn stone
Mm,
of a sort of standing stone size and shape.
mm,
But also there was a lot of variety in the geology of those stones as well. So whether um, someone had gone to a lot of trouble to collect them from a lot of different sources, and that'd
mm.
be the sort of thing you might get in a stone circle or one of these henges where they had to have 100 of these things. Whereas and the souterrain had simply just they just crossed the river, taken a few of them, chopped them up, and put them in the thing. But we don't know because
Mm.
without the art, you can't really tell. You're right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So there is a certain level of kind of speculation.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Well, that comforts me a lot. I don't feel so
Speculation and archaeology.
ignorant for not being able to tell the difference between a formerly standing stone. Um, so I suppose one last thing just to mention about the Souterrains before we move on is Souterrain ware pottery is you know, it's most prevalent around sort of the Loudmead Monaghan area. And being a person who's proud to be from the area that has the most of anything, actually, especially when we've got the Wee County complex behind us, they're not very well studied, the Souterrain ware pottery. So I know it's, you know, it's not maybe highly decorated, but why is it so poorly studied?
Well,
Well,
it's very regional for a start.
yeah.
Okay.
It's also very functional pottery, in that it's basically used for cooking,
Yes.
and you don't find it associated with burials or ceremonial activity because we're into the Christian period. So you don't find intact pots because they haven't been specially deposited anywhere. So you're just getting sherds.
Mm.
But with regards to being poorly studied, I don't think so. I just think that it's not widespread. So you're kind of limited as to what you can actually say about it, apart from
Yeah.
the fact that it's very unique in the Irish range of artifacts, in that during that period we're not making indigenous pottery anywhere else in the country apart from sort of the northeast.
Yeah. And I mean, I suppose I know there's a few ceramicists who watch my channel, so they would probably beg to differ that it's not it's
Mm.
not absolutely fascinating. You know, they probably want to know what kind of clay they were using and all that sort of stuff. So, you know, it's arguable that there is more to study, but I suppose you really have to be into that particularly in order to go that deep into it. And it's, you know, there's probably other ways of finding out about the people who were creating it. We don't necessarily need to go so in depth into this quite plain
Oh
pottery.
yeah, no, but it's fascinating because what you know why is it being made in this particular part of the country, and why isn't it being made elsewhere? And you know, Ireland has this kind of unique position on pottery in that we made fantastic pots in the Bronze Age period, and then for some reason we just stopped making ceramics in the Iron Age and into the early medieval period. So there's a, you know, why?
Yeah,
Nobody can really answer that.
yeah. God, that is quite intriguing.
And the problem
Um,
with the Souterrain ware pottery is that when it gets broken, it's very crumbly. So if you
mm,
get two pieces that should fit together, they don't because all the edges have crumbled.
yeah,
And so pottery specialists have said if you've got 10 sherds of Souterrain ware, they could come from 10 different pots, or they could come from the same pot because you can't fit them back together again very easily.
yeah,
And the reason it's called Souterrain ware is because it sort of turns up in souterrains, but everyone's noted for years that the stuff that comes from souterrains is only 2 or 3 sherds. It's never a complete pot.
yeah.
And the mostly complete pot that we found in the Tatitra souterrain was well, it was the complete base, and it looked like it had been used as a lamp, so that you could fill the pottery base with oil and have a wick, and that would be a lamp. And it was put in a tucked away place where it wouldn't get in the way. And so maybe all the pottery that we're finding in souterrains is sort of the last bit of the pot being reused as a
Being
lamp.
reused as a lamp.
Because
That's fascinating. You know, I'm a big proponent of the reduce, reuse, recycle myself.
yeah,
And when you have made a piece of perfectly good, you know, pottery, even the reuse of it can tell us something as well. So, jumping way forward in time then to we're talking, yeah, early Christianity, but onwards to Edward de Bruce, honing in specifically on the Faughart area. So, a couple, you know, one of the things I think is fascinating that, um, swords, I suppose, come up a surprising amount in the stories of Bridget or Saint Bridget, as you know, she was always meant to have been selling her father's swords, selling people's swords, and so she'd have looked at that and gone, "Great, that's a valuable thing that I can use for charity for people who need it more." But what I find sort of a poignant kind of picture is that when Edward de Bruce came then in the 14th century, you could imagine his men land into the area. Maybe their swords need a bit of maintenance, maybe they need new swords, and they go to the local forge. And there could well have been St. Bridget's crosses hanging in the forge. And I find it interesting that two such different characters, could maybe be connected by something as kind of random as that kind of weaponry. So, can you talk to us a little bit about sort of going back, I suppose, to Bridget's time? What about finds relating to Iron Age metalwork in the area? Have we got much on that?
Well,
Yeah,
one of the sites that I excavated, Balregan, we found, which is an early medieval site dating kind of between the 6th and the 10th century. We got a lot of Souterrain ware on it as well.
Hmm.
I think the specialist kind of dated the Souterrain ware there between the 8th and the 11th century. But one part of that site, we did find a huge spread of burnt material, um, which would have been within the enclosure site. And beneath that were a number of pits and evidence for burning, again with some Souterrain pots, and there was a metal punch. So we think that that was probably a forge dating, maybe 7th, 8th century forge. And then just to the north of the site, outside of the site area, we found a huge area of the detritus of metal ore reduction. So we got a lot of slag, and we got a lot of what looked like fragments of items that had been melted down, and we got evidence for ceramics, iron metalworking ceramics, which probably represented the shaft of a furnace. So that would have been an area where they would have prepared the ore, which would then have been used in the forge inside the enclosure to create whatever items they wanted to create. Unfortunately, we don't know what kind of items they were creating. They could have been creating anything from bells to just maintaining their own farm implements on that site. But I think that was the strongest evidence we had on the scheme for metalworking from that early medieval period.
Yeah. And what about jumping forward then to kind of 14th century when de Bruce would have been there?
no, the only site we had that was probably related to Edward the Bruce was Fort Hill, just next to the Shane's Balregan site there,
Tell us
where it
about
looks
that.
like there was a sort of, in response to the invasions, they might have molded the hilltop into a 14th century fort, and that's why it was called Fort Hill. And so there was a sort of Mott and Bailey sort of arrangement up there.
Hmm. Would that have been, I mean, was that done by de Bruce or as a response to de Bruce?
Probably as a response, because it seemed to have been occupied up until the 16th century. Is that right, Shane?
Yeah.
And so it's what Bruce came down, 13, 15 to 18. So he was in and out 3 times very quickly. And he was basically just passing through. And he was using the Great North Road, which is the old road from Faughart Upper to Jonesborough. And Faughart Upper is obviously got the Bridget associations, and Faughart Lower was where we had a very large early medieval site with a cemetery, and that was the one that had the plough buried in it. So that always shows the agricultural richness of the area. But a lot of the richness was basically to do with this routeway from the north to the south that passed through this land. And so if you controlled the routeway by taxing people or whatever, you got a big income from that, and you became very rich. And that could be one of the reasons why Faughart Upper site is so important.
Mm.
And that's
And
why Bruce
actually,
came down. Yeah,
yeah, and Bridget's father in some of the stories is said to have been a chieftain. Would it have been the likes of a chieftain who would have been controlling and taxing roads like that?
absolutely. And normally what happens is when there's a chieftain, that he usually has a couple of sons or whatever, and one of them becomes the replacement chieftain and the other one becomes a priest.
Mm.
And what you tend to find in these massive townland parishes, which is what Faughart is that you get a lot of interrelated sites, some of which are almost ecclesiastic, but they're actually just the priest site. because the
Mm.
priests were farmers too. And so you get, this is all a big family concern, if you like. Everyone's buying into that family, and they're controlling everything in that area, and that's their heartland. And then I think I'm right that the Faughart site was taken over by, continued its religious associations with, because it was taken over by Meliphant from County Meath.
Oh, is that right? We're actually
Yeah,
featuring Meliphant in the series as well.
yeah. So I think Meliphant had that land around Ballymascanlon certainly, and maybe Faughart Lower as well, and that continues that religious association that they have there. But again, it's all coming down to the Great North Road routeway that seems to be the big communications route through the area.
Yeah. And when you say the Great North Road, would that have been, is that connected to the Sliabh Maluachra, or would it have been some, iteration of some part of it, or is that a completely separate thing?
Probably something along those lines, because I mean it was the main communications route for the Anglo-Normans when they went from Dundalk further north, and right up until fairly recently, because there were tower houses built along it in the south of Jonesborough, and to control this significant routeway through the mountains up there, and into North Ulster.
At the Gap
So
of the North there.
yeah, the Gap of the North
Has been a feature of stories going right back to mythical times, and the sort of the importance of that part of the country, and the importance of controlling it
Yeah.
or avoiding it, as the case may be. So considering all the, the really important, or no, sorry, I want to ask first. There was a very large medieval graveyard found with over 700 remains found, but it has been stated that this was not connected with the Battle of Faughart, rather dating back to 600 AD and being used over several centuries. So that one, at a glance, you might kind of go, well, the Battle of Faughart took place here. That's probably a battle graveyard, but actually no, it's dating a little bit, it's a little bit later than Bridget, but it's closer to her time than to Bruce's. But is it unusual to find a medieval graveyard of that size?
No, not on the large road schemes that have been done. That one is particularly large, but then the site was particularly large. So normally, you get a graveyard which would be going with a sort of priest side of the family,
Mm.
and there might be 100 or 200 people in there. Shane's Balregan had 30, 40, 50 people. But one of that size is unusual. And in fact, Shane's just brought out a new book, The Forgotten Cemetery, about a big cemetery settlement that he dug in Ranelagh in County Roscommon. So
Tell us a bit about that, Shane.
Oh, it was a very, very large site that evolved over time. Started out as probably as an unenclosed sort of farm settlement, and they had a small cemetery in the center of it, which would have been a familial cemetery for the people that lived there. And then it evolved into a ring fort sometime in probably the 5th century. And then they became wealthier, maybe more important in the area, and the ring fort then was backfilled, and they expanded it and built a more impressive ditch around the outside of it with annexes, and the cemetery expanded with time basically. And then the site itself seems to have changed focus. It became more of like an assembly area, maybe a distribution center for the local chief, and the cemetery became central to whatever activities were going on there. So it kind of became a centralized space to bury the local population, but also to redistribute possibly wealth, or well, I suppose we got a lot of animal bone, particularly butchered cattle bone. So there may have been a redistribution of that kind of material to the local community. And then the site itself then just wound down towards the 11th, 12th century with the influx of, say, the Anglo-Normans and the growth of the big Gaelic families like the O'Connors, focus was taken away from this site as a centralized place for burial and assembly to other centres. And I'd say the burials then became the norm to be buried in church-run graveyards away from these old familial and hereditary burial grounds. So by the 12th century, the site had completely wound down and had gone out of use.
So is that a good example of the development of such a site, you know, that may have just started as kind of maybe a domestic site with a small graveyard to then become a ring fort to...
No, it's a very unusual site.
Okay.
Now it's not rare, but it's an unusual site in that. But it's got all the buzzwords that you would associate with a site that gained importance. It was on an area beside, sort of on the edge of two territories. It's in an area that was ruled over by a certain family, and it probably marked ancestral graves that were important. So it wasn't just a ring fort located. As you see, ring forts, there's 45,000 of them all over the country, dotted practically anywhere. But this was located a very special space in the local geography of the area, political geography of the area.
And in that way, it does reflect the Fard Lower site on the A1N1 quite closely, because the Fard Lower site ended up by being circular, about 110 meters in diameter. It just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it got taken over by Vikings, because there was some hack silver ingots found and some Viking knives. But then they probably just carried on burying there. And this is just one. There's another cemetery, early medieval cemetery, a couple of 100 meters away. So then they just fizzled out. As Shane says, the burial moves to the actual church sites.
Yeah.
Probably.
And I suppose when 700 remains were found, sounds like a lot, but when you consider that it was used over the course of several centuries, it's not really quite. So, it makes a lot more sense in that context. But all in all, from the excavation sites from the M1 dig, there have been a massive selection of finds found, spanning basically, right back to our earliest prehistory of human civilization in Ireland. That, well, I suppose not the very earliest, but the earliest that we'd be used to getting finds from, back to the Neolithic. Is it possible that, the fact we've got all of this stuff in such a small area, is it possible that the sites between Balregan and Faughart were part of a much larger ancient complex, like those in the Boyne or the Screen valleys?
Yeah, easily. Yeah.
So we could have, our own Boyne Valley here that we just haven't necessarily kind of dug it up maybe and marketed it the way we did. We didn't get the OPW on the case in the same way.
Well, as Niall mentioned earlier, at Balregan, the confluence of the two rivers there, there is an antiquarian drawing of a massive ceremonial landscape featuring numerous enclosures, mounds, standing stones. And our site, Balregan, which would have been about 60 meters in diameter, if you're to go by that map, is only a small site in comparison to the other sites that were there that there's no evidence for. And that's just one site.
So it's reasonable to believe that the, Dundalk, or Old Dundalk at least, and the wider surrounds would have been quite a significant area, maybe socially, maybe even politically. Certainly had a very rich culture of ritual and that sort of thing going on. So, we're actually privileged to be living in such a richly inhabited area that has had so much work taken place over the past few decades and to have found all of these things that are there.
Because it's quite a defined area as well, because there's the lovely Dundalk Bay, which is on the eastern side. To the north, you've got the mountains, and then inland, you've got the drumlins. So you've only really got this coastal strip, and as far as the River Glyde or whatever, and Annagassan, and that is an extremely rich focus of archaeological activity throughout history. And what you tend to find is that the sites of early medieval period, for example, they wouldn't all cluster in the same place, but they'd all be within a few kilometers of each other and keeping an eye on each other, and they're all getting richer and richer as time goes on. Because if Dundalk, you've got Dromiskin, and you've got Dundalk itself with its Castletown Mount, and then you've got the Balregan complex at the head of the bay, and you've got the bay itself, access to the sea, and all the coastal works that are going on there. And then you go up to the hills to the north, and so you're controlling the communications, and you're in a defined area that's very rich. Sorry,
Yeah,
man.
well, it's interesting. I always thought, growing up, I suspected that I lived in Magic Land, and there was something special about the place where I came from. I think probably most children think that, but it's interesting to grow up and find out you were right.
Well, North Louth is very different from South Louth, because South Louth was only tacked on there by the Anglo-Normans. So North Louth was always its own, but the Normans thought it was too small, even though it was very rich. So they took a chunk of what's now Meath,
Yeah.
and put it into Louth.
And I suppose yous are in an interesting position for, a unique position for me to be able to ask something that's often leveled, an accusation that's often leveled at people in sort of early Irish history or prehistory, is that they were constantly warring. And, it's interesting there, the way you say after the summer grazing or the winter grazing, there may well have been a big feast had where communities got together and met up and socialized with each other. And obviously socializing between communities probably would have been necessary for procreating and inheriting of land, or once we got into that sort of thing. But was there much evidence found of infighting? I know we had the Vikings to deal with and all of that sort of thing. It's hard to imagine civilizations living right next door to each other in, as you say, such a small strip of land for such a long time if they were constantly killing each other. What do you think
Yeah,
about
no,
that?
it's unusual in that all the graves that were dug up on this motorway project, there was virtually none had actually showed signs of murder or
Violent death.
violence. And normally in an early medieval burial population, you would find people who have been killed and stabbed and various mutilations, but the ones around Dundalk, there wasn't. There was one burial at Fard Lower, which looked like he'd obviously died somewhere else, and what they'd done is they'd wrapped him up in a sort of fetal position so that his bones had slightly come out, and obviously brought him back here from somewhere else. And that shows quite people being looked after rather than violence, even though he might have died somewhere else. But no, we didn't really see the violence.
There were fragments of a skull from the backfill of the Souterrain in Kearns Moore 1, but that may just have been bone that ended up in there. Maybe there's some burials just on the opposite side of the site that was outside of the CPO.
Wow.
And I think there was a fragment of a skull from Newtown Balregan 6 as well. From the ditch,
and there was
maybe?
quite a lot on the other sites. And M3, for example, had a skull fragment would be kicking around an early medieval site.
Yeah.
Something they liked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or else a fragment of an ancestor
Yeah.
curated.
That's fascinating, and that really turns our, a lot of ideas we had about earlier Irish history on its head. We are kind of led to believe that we couldn't coexist with each other for any length of time without constant war and murder and all that sort of thing. So it was Edward de Bruce then we have to blame for a disproportionate amount of violence in the area. Do you think that the significance, whether it's the social or spiritual significance of that, the larger complex that we're kind of discovering here, do you think that that would have influenced the level of attention that Edward de Bruce paid to the area during his time in Ireland? I know it's kind of defensive to to be visiting the Gap of the North or trying to hold the Gap of the North or anything like that, but do you think there would have been other factors like that? People would often come in and try to take over your most powerful landmarks and sites to show that they're in charge now. Do you think there was an element of that going on?
Definitely. I mean, I'm not an expert on Edward de Bruce, but I know he was crowned High King of all Ireland in Dundalk, and
Crowned himself, I think.
crowned himself. He got there, and he did it on the doorstep to make sure that when he went off from there, he was going from a position of power. So he felt it was a powerful place that he'd want to be associated with to
Mm.
crown himself.
So it was
King.
a bit of a PR stunt.
Yeah.
And do you think then that he'd have been paying much heed to the likes of legends about Bridget or other influential, potentially spiritual types who had existed there? So we talked about that at the Kearns Moore Kist Cemetery where you had, that one central figure. Do you think legends about, people that had gone before there, that he would have been trying to maybe tie himself to that sort of thing and go, look, I'm as powerful in this area as those people were.
Absolutely.
So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Castletown Mount is called Cuchullin's Castle, and that was where he was supposed to have had his base and overlooking the bay at one stage. So crowning yourself king there has massive associations with Cuchulainn the hero. So powerful.
Yeah, I don't know that we've ever actually. I know Wikipedia says he crowned himself at Castletown Mount, but I don't think there's ever any been actual evidence found for that. But he is said to have crowned himself at any one of half a dozen other sites, including some of the medieval taverns, which would have stood in the centre of Dundalk town at time. One I think was called the King's Head. So, we didn't get his head soon enough. But, so I suppose just to wrap this up, lads, considering how rich the selection of finds are in this area of North Louth, which has clearly been populated since Ireland's earliest settlements were established, do you think that there might be more finds? You've kind of already answered this about, one area, but do you think that there may be more finds waiting for future archaeologists in and around the M1 or even further afield, considering, how important what we have found seems to be?
Yeah, definitely. I know for a fact that the developments that have been ongoing around Dundalk area are still turning up sites and significant sites. There's an area south of Dundalk, Haggardstown. There's been a significant and substantial amount of archaeology from all periods has turned up when that big housing estate was being built, for example. So yeah, there's Dundalk is a hotbed of archaeology throughout the ages, and there's still a lot more to find.
Look at Niall and Shane, thank you so much for joining me. It's just been fascinating finding out more about our own area, the area that a lot of us grew up in. And, these digs happened 2002 to 2004. We're talking nearly 20 years ago at this stage. And we don't talk about them an awful lot anymore. So I really appreciate you digging back through all of your notes and reports and coming in to have a chat with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
You're welcome.
And to all our listeners and viewers, don't forget to hit subscribe for more fun and witchy adventures. I upload most Thursdays and you're not going to want to miss it. Slán agus beannacht, goodbye and good luck to you.